It was supposed to be a routine overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. 228 people, families, business travelers, and crew, settling in for an 11-hour journey across the Atlantic. But 3.5 hours later, Flight 447 vanished. No distress call, no radar contact, just silence over the ocean. For years, no one knew what had happened. How could one of the most advanced jets in the world simply disappear? This is the story of the final minutes of Air France Flight 447, when technology turned against the crew. On the night of May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447 prepared for departure from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The flight was operated by an Airbus A330-203, one of the most modern aircraft of its time. Its destination, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France. On board were 216 passengers and 12 crew members. The cockpit was manned by 3 experienced pilots, Captain Marc Dubois, age 58, with over 11,000 flight hours, First Officer David Robert, 37, and relief co-pilot Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32. At 7:29 p.m. local time, Flight 447 took off into the humid Brazilian night. No one on board could have imagined that within hours they would encounter one of the most tragic and baffling disasters in modern aviation history. The Airbus A330 was known for its reliability. It used advanced fly-by-wire technology, meaning the pilot's inputs were interpreted by computers, which then controlled the aircraft's surfaces. It was designed to reduce human error, but in rare moments, it could also make the crew dangerously dependent on automation. That night, the Atlantic was covered by massive tropical thunderstorms. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, a region notorious for turbulent weather. But such storms were not unusual for this route. The crew adjusted their course slightly to avoid the heaviest clouds. At around 1:35 a.m., the A330 was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet, hundreds of miles from land, flying through darkness and high clouds. Autopilot was on. Passengers slept. But in just a few minutes, everything would change. At 2:10 a.m., the aircraft entered a region of heavy turbulence and ice crystals. Tiny particles of ice began forming on the plane's pitot tubes, the small sensors that measure airspeed. When these sensors froze, they started sending conflicting speed readings to the flight computers. And the computers, unable to make sense of it, automatically disconnected the autopilot. Inside the cockpit, Captain Dubois was on a scheduled rest break. The 2 younger co-pilots were flying. Suddenly, the relief pilot, Bonin, took manual control. He pulled back on the side stick, climbing steeply to avoid turbulence. But this was the beginning of a deadly chain reaction. As the plane climbed rapidly, the airspeed indicators continued giving false readings. The flight computers, now confused, disabled several flight protections. Within seconds, the A330 was flying manually in pitch-black sky, with no reliable speed information. Bonin continued pulling back, trying to keep the nose up, but at high altitude, this caused the aircraft to lose lift. The plane began to stall, its wings unable to generate enough airflow to stay aloft. The stall warning blared repeatedly. But in the confusion of darkness, turbulence, and failing instruments, the pilots misinterpreted the situation. They believed the plane was diving too fast, not slowing down. So Bonin kept pulling back, making things worse. The aircraft was now climbing at a dangerous 7,000 feet per minute, far beyond its limits. Then the nose dropped sharply. In less than a minute, the plane went from 38,000 feet to 35,000. And kept falling. The pilots struggled, each giving conflicting inputs, unaware that one was pulling up while the other tried to push down. But the Airbus flight computers blended their commands, neutralizing each other. The result? No effective recovery. For the next 3 minutes, the A330 descended through the night sky. Engines were working, wings were intact. But the aircraft remained stalled, falling almost flat, nose high, wings trembling. They still didn't realize the true situation. The stall warnings had stopped because the sensors detected too little airflow, tricking the system. At 2:14 a.m., the captain rushed back into the cockpit. But it was too late. He looked at the instruments and said quietly, "Just 4 minutes after the first failure." Air France Flight 447 slammed into the Atlantic Ocean at over 10,000 feet per minute. The impact destroyed the aircraft instantly. All 228 people on board were killed. In the days that followed, the world was in shock. No one knew where the plane had gone down. For weeks, search teams scoured the Atlantic, recovering only floating debris, seat cushions, parts of the tail, and bodies. It took 2 years before investigators finally found the black boxes, resting 13,000 feet below the surface. What they discovered was chilling. The data confirmed that the pitot tubes had iced over, triggering the chain of events. But the true tragedy was what happened after that. When the automation failed, the pilots were suddenly thrust into a situation they were no longer trained to handle: manual flight at high altitude. They were confused, misled by false warnings, and struggling to communicate under stress. The official BEA report concluded that the crash resulted from temporary loss of airspeed data due to icing, inappropriate pilot reactions to those readings, and lack of understanding of high-altitude stall behavior. Automation had failed, but human response sealed the fate of the flight. The irony was heartbreaking. The more advanced aircraft became, the less prepared crews were to handle its sudden failures. In the aftermath, airlines and regulators made crucial changes. The pitot tubes on all Airbus aircraft were redesigned to prevent icing. Pilot training was overhauled worldwide, emphasizing manual flying skills and stall recovery, especially at high altitude. Air France also changed its procedures for cockpit communication and hierarchy, encouraging open discussion between crew members. But for the families of the 228 victims, answers could never replace what was lost. Their loved ones' final moments remain a haunting reminder of how even the smallest technical flaw, mixed with human confusion, can bring down a giant of the skies. Technology can make us safer, but in aviation, as in life, trust must always be balanced with awareness. Because sometimes, when the machines go silent, it's up to humans to find their way back.